The late summer sun of 1874 beat down mercilessly on the Texas Panhandle, transforming the endless prairie into a shimmering ocean of golden grass that stretched to every horizon. The Harrington wagon train crawled across this vastness, like a line of Beatles' 17 families bound together by shared dreams of California gold and the desperate hope that lay beyond the next ridge. Eliza Charlotte gripped the wooden seat of her wagon with white knuckles, her brown hair whipping free from its careful pins, as the vehicle lurched over another hidden rock. At 22, she had spent enough years on frontier trails to know the difference between routine discomfort and genuine danger. Something about this particular stretch of country made her stomach clench with unease. The grass grew too tall, providing perfect concealment, and the usual wildlife had fallen silent. "Papa always said to trust your instincts," she whispered to herself, touching the leather toolkit that contained her father's farrier equipment. William Charlotte had died of cholera 4 winters past, but his lessons about reading country and judging men remained sharp as the day he had taught them. The first rifle shot cracked across the prairie like breaking timber. "Raiders incoming." Thomas Harrington's voice boomed from the lead wagon as his oxen bellowed in panic. "Circle up women and children to the center." But there was no time to form the protective circle that might have saved them. The attackers had chosen their moment with military precision, striking when the train was strung out, with no natural cover for miles. 6 mounted figures burst from the concealing grass like demons, their faces masked with dirty bandanas, and their rifles already speaking death. The lead rider was a stocky man with greasy black hair, Greasy Pete, whose name was whispered in saloons from Dodge City to Santa Fe. His partner, red-bearded Rusty Joe, whooped like a drunken raider as he fired his Winchester, more interested in spreading terror than hitting specific targets. Eliza's wagon lurched violently as the driver tried to turn toward the forming circle. But the left wheel caught in a prairie dog hole with a sound like breaking bones. The vehicle crashed onto its side in an explosion of splintered wood and scattered belongings that had taken her father years to accumulate. Pain lanced through her shoulder as she struck the ground hard, driving the breath from her lungs and filling her mouth with dust and fear. Around her, the air erupted with gunpowder smoke and screams of horses and humans caught in unexpected slaughter. Through the chaos, a shadow moved. A lone rider emerged from the dust cloud on a paint horse that seemed to flow across the broken ground like water. Unlike the whooping raiders, this man rode in complete silence, his black hair braided with eagle feathers and his bronze chest marked with white war paint. In his hands, he carried a Spencer repeating carbine with the casual competence of someone born knowing how to kill. Toko of the Comanche was 33 years old and had been tracking these raiders for 4 days across the vast Llano Estacado. His small band of 12 families had left the confines of the reservation to hunt buffalo in their traditional grounds, following the ancient rhythms that had sustained his people for countless generations. He cared nothing for white settlers and their distant dreams, but men who killed for pleasure and profit were a different matter entirely. His horse exploded through the gun smoke at full gallop, and Toko swung his carbine like a war club and the heavy stock catching Greasy Pete between the shoulder blades, with enough force to lift the outlaw clear of his saddle. Pete hit the ground hard, gasping like a landed fish as his rifle spun away. "What in blazes?" Pete started, then looked up into Toko's Spencer and decided silence might serve better. The other raiders wheeled their horses in confusion, suddenly facing an enemy they had never expected. Their carefully planned ambush was dissolving as an actual Comanche warrior materialized like a ghost from the old wars. Toko's dark eyes swept the battlefield with calculating precision. The wagon train families were beginning to recover, and several men had taken defensive positions. More shots would bring more casualties, and the whites would blame all Indians for whatever happened here. His attention fixed on Eliza as she struggled to free herself from the wagon wreckage, her blue wool dress torn. but her movements showing the practical determination that marked a survivor. A .36 caliber ball from one of the raiders' Navy Colts had already creased his ribs, painting a thin line of blood across his skin. But he ignored the wound as he dismounted with fluid grace. "Stay still," he commanded in accented English, his voice carrying quiet authority. Without waiting for response, he scooped her up in a fireman's carry. "Put me down this instant." Eliza gasped, her fists beating weakly against his shoulders as exhaustion drained her strength. Fear made her voice tight, but underneath lay something harder, the stubborn courage that had carried her through 4 years of frontier hardships since her father's death. "If I leave you here with these men," Toko replied, already moving toward the creek bed 50 yards away as bullets whined overhead. "They will use you for their pleasure before they cut your throat. Is that what you prefer?" The blunt honesty hit Eliza like cold water, washing away polite assumptions and forcing her to confront brutal realities. She had heard the whispered stories around campfires, what happened to women taken by raiders, how their bodies were found, when buzzards led searchers to shallow graves. Behind them, Pete rolled to his knees and snatched up a fallen revolver, his face twisted with rage. "Damn redskin thinks he can steal our prize." Toko reached the creek bank and lowered Eliza behind cattails and willow scrub, his movements economical, despite the blood seeping from his bullet graze. From this position, they could see Pete and his men regrouping near the wagons, their horses dancing nervously as rifle fire continued. "She belongs to me now," Toko called across the water, his voice pitched to carry to both raiders and wagon defenders. "Prisoner taken in honorable combat under Comanche custom." The claim served multiple purposes, establishing Eliza's status as his responsibility, rather than free plunder invoking tribal law that even white courts sometimes recognized, and giving the raiders an excuse to withdraw without losing face. Then quieter, so only Eliza could hear. "And under my protection for as long as you need it." Eliza stared up at him through the willow screen, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she tried to process what had happened to her world. This warrior had claimed her as prisoner, but he had also saved her from a fate worse than death. Her father had taught her to judge men by actions rather than words, and Toko's actions spoke of calculated mercy rather than savage cruelty. "Why?" She whispered the word, carrying all her confusion and desperate hope. Toko's gaze remained fixed on the raiders as they argued among themselves. "Because no woman should die as these men would kill you," he said simply. "White or Comanche, some things are not permitted by any law worth following." Across the creek, Pete spat in the dust and holstered his gun with visible reluctance. The wagon train survivors were organizing now, and the advantage had shifted decisively. This wasn't worth dying for, not with an actual Comanche to complicate their story. "This ain't finished, you red devil," Pete shouted, but he was already mounting as he spoke. "Nobody steals from Greasy Pete and lives to tell it." The raiders withdrew at a gallop, disappearing into the grassland that had concealed their approach. In the sudden silence, Eliza became aware of her thundering heartbeat and the warm weight of Toko's hand steadying her shoulder. Gunpowder smoke hung in the still air, mixing with creek water and the metallic tang of blood. Somewhere behind them, a woman was crying high, keening sobs, speaking of loss too great for simple tears. "Are you hurt?" Eliza asked the question, emerging from her father's training before she could consider the implications of showing concern for her captor. Toko glanced at the shallow furrow across his ribs. "It will mend." "Let me see it." She insisted, her practical nature overriding fear as she studied the injury professionally. "My father was a farrier, but he taught me to tend wounds on both animals and people. That needs cleaning before infection sets in. From across the creek came voices raised in argument, the survivors debating whether to pursue or tend their wounded. Eliza could hear her name being called, but the voices carried uncertainty that hadn't been there before she had been claimed by a Comanche warrior. "They fear you now," Toko observed, following her gaze. "You have been touched by the enemy, which makes you dangerous in their eyes." "Then I truly am your prisoner." Eliza said the words carrying more acceptance than despair. She had always been practical above all else, and the mathematics were brutally simple. The wagon train would never fully trust her again. Toko represented her best chance of survival in a world that had just become infinitely more dangerous. "Only if you choose to be," he replied, offering her a choice most captives never received. "The creek runs both ways. You can return to your people and take your chances with their suspicion, or come with me and learn what lies beyond their small understanding." Eliza looked back at the wagon train one more time, seeing fear and distrust written on faces of people who had been her companions for 3 months. Then she looked at Toko, reading quiet honor in his dark eyes and the careful respect with which he had treated her despite claiming captors' rights. "I'll come with you," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her voice. "At least until we reach some place where the law might listen to reason." Toko nodded once, sealing a compact between them. "Then we ride for Red Mesa, where my people wait. You will be safe there while we decide what comes next." The journey to Toko's camp carried them across country that seemed to stretch forever beneath a sky so vast it made Eliza dizzy to contemplate. They rode single file along game trails, barely visible to her inexperienced eyes, following paths worn by generations of buffalo and the nomadic people who had lived in harmony with both. Red Mesa rose from the grassland like a sleeping giant, its sandstone cliffs glowing amber in the late afternoon sun. At its base, sheltered in a natural fold, providing protection from constant prairie winds, the temporary camp of Toko's Quahati band spread in patterns as old as human civilization. 12 buffalo-hide teepees formed a rough circle around a central fire pit, their conical shapes blending so naturally with the landscape that Eliza might have missed them entirely, without the thin smoke streams rising from their peaks. Beyond, the camp horses grazed on rich grass near hidden springs, their numbers telling her this was a prosperous band, understanding the value of good animals. Children played between the lodges with unconscious grace of young creatures raised in perfect freedom, and their laughter carrying on the evening breeze like music. Women worked at various tasks, tanning hides, preparing food, crafting the 100 necessities that kept a nomadic people comfortable, while men tended weapons and discussed the day's events in low, serious tones, of people understanding that survival depended on constant vigilance. It was not the savage war camp of newspaper illustrations and dime novels. It was a functioning community organized with efficiency from centuries of proven practice. Toko's Uncle Shyla emerged from the largest teepee as they approached. At 60, he carried himself with austere dignity of a man who had seen empires rise and fall while remaining true to older, more enduring values. His gray hair hung in 2 long braids decorated with silver conchos catching firelight, and his weathered face bore intricate tattoos, marking his status as keeper of tribal memory. The 2 men spoke rapidly in Comanche, their voices low, but carrying unmistakable weight of serious discussion. Eliza caught occasional words from her limited trading post experience, but most conversation flowed past her understanding like water over stones. She sat straight in her saddle throughout the exchange, projecting dignity she didn't entirely feel, while dozens of curious eyes examined her. These people were deciding her fate with the same careful deliberation they might use choosing a campsite or planning a hunt, and she found their calm professionalism oddly reassuring after the chaos and terror of the raid. Finally, Toko turned to her with an expression revealing nothing of what had been decided. "You will stay in my sister's lodge," he said in careful English. "Wachiwi will see to your needs and teach you what you must know to live safely among us." As if summoned by his words, a young woman appeared at Eliza's stirrup with effortless grace, speaking of a life lived in perfect harmony with surroundings. Wachiwi was 19 with the lithe build of someone who had never known a sedentary moment, and her buckskin dress was decorated with intricate beadwork, seeming to flow and shift in firelight. In her hands, she carried a short, recurved bow of polished wood, and a quiver filled with iron-tipped arrows tools looking as natural in her grip as a needle might in a white woman's fingers. But it was her eyes that caught Eliza's attention, dark and intelligent, filled with curiosity, marking a natural teacher. "Welcome, sister prisoner," Wachiwi said in English, more precise than her brother's, though colored by the same musical accent. "Come, we will make you comfortable and see to your wounds." Eliza slid down from her horse, on legs trembling with exhaustion and delayed reaction to the day's violence. The leather bonds marking her captive status were loose enough to allow circulation, but visible enough to establish her position in the camp's social hierarchy, a practical arrangement preventing misunderstandings while allowing enough freedom to be useful. Inside the teepee that would serve as her temporary home, Eliza found herself in a space both alien and oddly comforting. Buffalo robes covered the ground in careful layers, providing insulation and creating a surface soft enough for sleeping. Personal belongings were arranged with military precision along curved walls, parfleches filled with preserved food weapons wrapped in soft leather, and tools for countless small tasks, keeping a nomadic people alive in harsh prairie beauty. Wachiwi brought her a wooden bowl filled with clean water and tanned doe skin, soft as silk for washing. The water was cool and sweet, tasting of minerals and vast distances. As Eliza cleaned dust and grime from her face and hands, she became aware of Wachiwi watching with intense curiosity of a naturalist studying some unknown species. "Your hands," Wachiwi said suddenly, reaching out to touch Eliza's fingers with gentle curiosity. "They are strong, marked by work. You are not like the soft women who sometimes travel with wagon trains." Eliza flexed her fingers, displaying calluses earned from years helping her father with the forge and tending injured animals on frontier trails. "My father was a farrier, a man who shoes horses and tends their injuries. I learned his trade because there was no one else to teach it to." Wachiwi's eyes brightened with genuine interest. "Horses are sacred to our people. One who can heal them has great value among us." She paused, tilting her head, as if listening to something Eliza couldn't hear. "My brother chose well when he claimed you from those evil men. The spirits whispered your worth to him in the moment of decision." Before Eliza could ask what that meant, Toko appeared at the teepee entrance. He had cleaned the blood from his ribs and changed into a fresh buckskin shirt, but the bullet graze was still visible as an angry red line across his bronze skin. In firelight, filtering through hide walls, his features looked carved from stone-strong jaw, high cheekbones, and those dark eyes seeming to see everything, while judging nothing. "The wound needs proper tending." Eliza observed her father's training, making her automatically catalog the injury's severity and treatment requirements. Without cleaning, such wounds often fester and poison the blood. Toko studied her face for a long moment, as if trying to read her motivations the way she might study an unfamiliar horse's behavior. Finally, he nodded and settled cross-legged on a buffalo robe near the small fire burning in the teepee's center flames, fed by dried buffalo chips that burned hot and clean without filling the enclosed space with choking smoke. Eliza knelt beside him and examined the bullet graze with the same professional attention she would give a horse's injured leg. The wound was shallow, but dirty with small particles of cloth and prairie grit embedded in torn flesh. Left untreated, it would almost certainly become infected within days. "I need clean water and something for bandages," she said, looking up at Wachiwi. The younger woman disappeared and returned quickly with a clay pot of water heated over the central fire, and several strips of soft doe skin tanned to the texture of fine linen. Eliza set to work cleaning the wound with methodical thoroughness her father had drilled into her during their years on the trail. Her touch gentle but thorough as she removed every trace of foreign matter from torn skin. Toko sat motionless throughout the procedure, his breathing steady and controlled despite what must have been considerable pain. This close, Eliza could smell sage and sweetgrass worked into his hair, and the clean scent of leather and wind seeming to cling to his skin like natural perfume. "Why did you really save me from those men?" she asked quietly as she bound the cleaned wound with strips of doe skin. "It wasn't just to claim a prisoner under your customs." Toko was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried weight of experiences she could only imagine. "I have seen what men like Pete do to captive women, white and Comanche alike. They use them until they break, then kill them to keep them quiet about what was done." He paused, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "My mother died that way, taken in a raid when I was barely old enough to draw a bow. The soldiers who found her said she had been used by many men before they cut her throat and left her for buzzards." The simple honesty struck Eliza like a physical blow, washing away any illusions about the romantic nature of frontier life. This was a man shaped by losses she could barely comprehend yet, who had chosen to show mercy to a stranger when he could easily have ridden past. "I'm sorry for your loss." She said the words feeling inadequate, but necessary. "And thank you for saving me whatever comes next." Toko looked down at her handiwork, testing the binding's tightness with careful fingers. The bandage was expertly applied tight enough to prevent bleeding, but loose enough to allow proper healing. "You have real skill with injuries. This is good medicine." Outside, the teepee sounds of the camp settling into evening rhythms drifted through hide walls like a domestic symphony. Children's voices calling out final games before darkness fell completely, horses nickering softly as they were brought closer for protection, and low murmur of adults discussing the day's events around the central fire. It was a sound reminding Eliza painfully of wagon train camps she had known for most of her adult life. The same mixture of weariness and contentment marking the end of another day survived in wilderness. Wachiwi returned with a bowl of stew made from buffalo meat and wild onions seasoned with herbs Eliza didn't recognize, but found surprisingly pleasant. The food was rich and filling, warming her from inside out after the long day's ordeal. As she ate, Wachiwi sat beside her and began working on a new bowstring, her fingers moving with unconscious skill of long practice. "Tell me about your family," she said without looking up from her work. "Your people, your home before the wagons. We should know these things if you are to stay among us." Eliza considered carefully how much to reveal. These people had shown kindness, but they were still essentially strangers holding her captive. Too much information might prove dangerous, but too little would seem suspicious and ungrateful. "My father's name was William Charlotte," she said finally. "We came west from Missouri 7 years ago looking for land where he could establish a smithy and farrier business. He died of cholera 4 winters past on a train bound for California." It was the truth as far as it went. She didn't mention the inheritance her father had left her, or the legal documents sewn into her corset's lining, or the man in Copper Gulch who claimed false authority over her future. Some secrets were too dangerous to share, even with people who had treated her with unexpected kindness. Wachiwi nodded sympathetically. It is hard to lose a father so young, but you carry his skills and his strength. That honors his memory better than tears. The simple wisdom brought unexpected comfort to Eliza, who had spent 4 years since her father's death feeling adrift in a world seeming determined to treat unprotected women as commodities to be bought and sold. As the fire burned down to glowing coals and Wachiwi prepared sleeping robes for the night, Toko rose to leave for his own lodge. At the entrance, he paused and looked back at Eliza with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Sleep well, Eliza Charlotte," he said, using her full name with careful pronunciation. "Tomorrow we will speak of what comes next and what choices remain open to you." After he was gone, Wachiwi helped Eliza arrange buffalo robes into a comfortable bed near the fire's warmth. The young Comanche woman moved with easy efficiency of someone who had been preparing sleeping places since childhood. But Eliza could feel her watching with the same curious attention she had shown earlier. "And you are not what I expected," Wachiwi said as she smoothed the final robe into place. "What did you expect?" Most white women who become prisoners spend their first night weeping and calling on their sky god for rescue. Wachiwi's tone was matter-of-fact, without judgment or malice. "You tend my brother's wound and ask practical questions about horses. This is different." Eliza settled herself on the soft robes, suddenly aware of how exhausted the day's events had left her. "I suppose I've learned that survival depends on accepting whatever situation you find yourself in and making the best of it. Tears don't change facts, and facts are what keep you alive." Wachiwi smiled at that, an expression of genuine warmth transforming her face from merely pretty to truly beautiful. "You may survive among us after all, white sister. Sleep now. Morning comes early and the horses wait for no one." As Eliza drifted toward sleep, listening to night sounds of the camp around her, she found herself thinking not of escape plans or rescue fantasies, but of the careful way Toko had allowed her to tend his wound, despite having every right to refuse her touch. It spoke of mutual respect she had rarely encountered in white settlements where women were expected to be decorative rather than useful. Whatever tomorrow brought, she was alive, unharmed, and among people who seemed to value competence over social convention. For a woman who had spent the last 4 years moving from one precarious situation to another, that represented more security than she had dared hope for. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when shouts and the thunder of approaching hooves shattered the peaceful quiet. Eliza woke to find Wachiwi already gone, her bow and quiver missing from their place near the teepee entrance. Outside, she could hear controlled urgency of people responding to potential danger with practiced efficiency of those who had learned that survival often depended on split-second reactions. She dressed quickly in the torn and dusty clothes from yesterday's ordeal. Her wool skirt was beyond repair, but still serviceable, and stepped outside to find the camp in controlled motion. Warriors moved between teepees, with purpose checking weapons, and speaking in rapid clip tones men used when preparing for violence. Near the central fire, elders had gathered around something commanding their complete attention. Even from a distance, Eliza could see tension in their postures and the grim set of their faces as they examined what appeared to be a piece of paper, glowing white against their weathered hands. Toko stood with his uncle Shyla, both men studying the document with intensity usually reserved for reading enemy sign on difficult ground. The bandage she had applied was visible beneath his buckskin shirt, but his movements showed no signs of impairment from the injury. As she approached the group, Eliza became aware of another presence that didn't belong to the camp's normal rhythms. Near the horse lines, 2 Comanche warriors held a white man on his knees between them. his wrists bound behind his back with rawhide and his clothes torn and bloody from what looked like a hard night spent running through rough country. The captive was clearly one of the raiders from yesterday's attack. She recognized the pock-marked face and greasy hair of one of Greasy Pete's men, though his earlier arrogance had been replaced by the desperate cunning of a cornered animal. "You," the man called out when he spotted her, his voice hoarse from shouting and fear. "Tell these savages I got information they need about that reward money and what it really means." Toko's head snapped up at the man's words, his dark eyes finding Eliza's face with an intensity that made her stomach clench with sudden dread. He spoke a few sharp words in Comanche, and one of the warriors clubbed the captive across the back of his head with a rifle butt, dropping him face first into the dust. "Come," Toko said to Eliza, his voice carrying controlled anger, more frightening than shouting. "There are things you must explain." She followed him to where the elders waited, her mind racing as she tried to imagine what the captured raider might have revealed. The piece of paper in Toko's hands looked official, heavy white stock with formal printing, suggesting government or legal authority. Shyla held the document out to her with ceremonial gravity of a man presenting evidence at a trial. "Can you read the white man's markings?" he asked in careful English. Eliza took the broadsheet with hands that trembled despite her efforts to remain calm. The header identified it as coming from the Willow Springs Herald, and the text was laid out in formal style of a legal notice. Reward notice $200 in silver coin for the safe return of Miss Eliza Charlotte Ward and legal dependent of Mr. Victor Dietrich of Copper Gulch Mining Consortium. Miss Charlotte was taken from the Harrington wagon train on August 15, 1874, by hostile Comanche raiders. She is described as 22 years of age, brown hair, average height, wearing blue wool traveling dress. Any information regarding her whereabouts should be directed to Deputy Edwin Harlan in Willow Springs or the Copper Gulch Assay Office. Reward payable upon positive identification and safe delivery. The words hit Eliza like a physical blow, driving air from her lungs and making her knees weak with shock and recognition. Victor Dietrich. The name brought back memories she had tried to bury for 4 years, a tall man with pale eyes and soft hands, who had appeared at her father's deathbed with papers claiming legal authority over her future. This man, Dietrich Toko, said, his voice deceptively calm. "You know him." It wasn't a question. Eliza looked up from the broadsheet to find every eye in the circle focused on her face, reading her expressions with the attention these people paid to tracking sign on difficult ground. There was no point in attempting to lie. Her reaction had already revealed the truth. "He claims to be my legal guardian," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "But he has no rightful authority over me." Shyla's weathered face remained impassive, but she caught the slight narrowing of his eyes, suggesting intense interest. "Explain this claim." The moment had come when half-truths and careful evasions would no longer serve. From the hidden pocket sewn into her corset's lining, Eliza withdrew the oilskin packet that had never left her person since her father's death. Her fingers worked quickly to unwrap layers of treated cloth, revealing heavy rag paper documents inside. "This is my father's will," she said, spreading the first paper carefully on a flat stone near the fire. "And this is the deed to his property along Ash River. Both documents name me as his sole heir, witnessed and notarized by proper authority." The deed was written in formal legal language required for land transfers in Texas. But the essential facts were clear enough even to those unfamiliar with white law. William Charlotte had claimed water rights along a 2-mile stretch of Ash River under homestead provisions. And those rights now belonged legally to his daughter. Toko studied the papers with the same careful attention he might give to reading weather sign on the horizon. This river runs through the valley, where my people bring their horses for winter grazing." "Yes," Eliza confirmed. "The riparian rights allow the holder to control water usage for irrigation, livestock, and mill operations within the specified boundaries. And Dietrich wants these papers for himself." "More than that." Eliza said, her voice growing harder as she remembered the scene at her father's deathbed. "He has forged documents claiming to be my legal guardian. If he can prove that claim in a county court, he gains control of my inheritance as my appointed protector under the law." The implications hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire, visible to everyone present despite the complexity of white legal customs. Control of those water rights would mean power over every farmer-rancher and settlement in the valley. It would mean the difference between prosperity and poverty for hundreds of families, white and Indian alike. And Victor Dietrich was willing to pay $200 more than most working men earned in a year just to get his hands on the woman who stood between him and that power. Wachiwi, who had been listening in silence from her position near her brother's shoulder, spoke up with the directness of youth. "The prisoner says there were others with him when they found our trail. More white men following our tracks toward this camp?" Toko's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "How many?" "He claims 8 riders, all armed with repeating rifles. They wait at the old Buffalo Crossing where Ash Creek bends toward the sunrise, perhaps 3 hours' ride from here." 8 men with modern weapons represented a serious threat to a camp containing women, children, and elders who couldn't be easily moved or hidden. The band's warriors could fight them certainly, but not without casualties they could ill afford to lose. More importantly, such a battle would bring the state authorities down on them like a prairie storm, with newspapers screaming about savage attacks on peaceful settlers and the army looking for someone to punish as an example. Shyla spoke several rapid sentences in Comanche, his tone carrying weight of decades spent navigating treacherous waters between white law and Indian survival. Toko listened, nodded, then turned back to Eliza with an expression she couldn't quite read. "My uncle reminds me that white man's law changes direction like the wind before a storm," he said. "But you believe this judge in Blackthorn would hear your case fairly against Dietrich?" "If I can reach him alive and with proof of Dietrich's forgeries, yes," Eliza replied. "Judge Thorne has a reputation for honesty, and Texas law is clear about inheritance rights. But I would need to present evidence that Dietrich's guardianship papers are fraudulent. Not 40 miles through country where his hired killers hunt for you." "Yes." Toko was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the camp, where morning sun was beginning to burn dew from the grass. When he spoke again, his voice carried finality of a decision that could not be unmade. "That we will escort you to this judge," he said. "Not as prisoner and captor, but as allies with common cause. Your water rights protect our winter pastures. Our protection gets you to Blackthorn alive." The offer was more than Eliza had dared hope for, but she could see the cost written in faces around the circle. This decision would put the entire band at risk, transforming them from neutral parties into active participants in a white man's legal dispute that could easily turn violent. "Why risk so much for a stranger?" she asked. It was Wachiwi who answered, her young voice carrying wisdom earned from a lifetime of watching her people lose ground to white expansion. "Because the men who hunt you today will come for our horses and our grass tomorrow. Better to fight them now with strong allies and good weapons than to wait for them to choose the time and place of battle." Toko nodded agreement. "My sister speaks wisdom. We leave within the hour, travel light, move fast. Trust that speed will serve us better than heavy packs or careful planning." As the council broke up and the camp began preparing for immediate departure, Eliza found herself holding her father's deed with hands that no longer trembled. For the first time since William Charlotte's death, she was no longer alone in fighting for what was rightfully hers. The alliance might be temporary and born of mutual necessity rather than sentiment, but it was real. And it gave her something she had almost forgotten, an existed hope that justice might actually be possible in a world that seemed designed to reward the strong and punish the weak. But as they saddled horses and checked weapons for the journey ahead, the sound of distant gunfire drifted across the prairie from the direction of the Buffalo Crossing. Dietrich's men had found something to shoot at, which meant their window of opportunity for peaceful escape was already closing. The race for Blackthorn would begin under fire. They departed Red Mesa as the sun reached its zenith, riding hard across country that stretched endlessly under a sky the color of heated steel. Toko led on his paint horse with Eliza mounted on a sturdy chestnut mare, and Wachiwi bringing up the rear on a black gelding that moved like flowing water across the broken ground. Each horse carried only the minimum necessary for survival water in hide bags, dried meat wrapped in oilcloth, and ammunition for weapons that never left their riders' sides. The plan was brutally simple: reach Blackthorn by the fastest route possible while avoiding known trails where Dietrich's men would be waiting with rifles and patience. The country they crossed was beautiful and treacherous in equal measure, offering concealment in its countless draws and coulees, while threatening disaster for any horse that stepped wrong in the maze of prairie dog holes and hidden gullies pocking the landscape like old bullet wounds. As they rode, Wachiwi began to hum a low wordless melody, seeming to flow with the rhythm of their horses' hoofbeats. It was a traveling song, she explained when Eliza asked, meant to bring good fortune to those undertaking dangerous journeys and to honor the spirits of places they passed through. Does it work? Eliza asked, genuinely curious about customs so different from her own Protestant upbringing. Ask me when we reach Blackthorn alive. Wachiwi replied with a smile, taking any sting from the words. The first sign of trouble came as they approached Owl Canyon, where the most direct route to Blackthorn led through a narrow defile between walls of red sandstone rising 60 feet on either side. It was the kind of place making every experienced traveler nervous: too many hiding spots for ambushers, too few escape routes if things went wrong. But it would save them 10 miles of hard riding across open country, where they could be spotted from great distances by anyone with field glasses and patient disposition. Toko raised his hand to halt them at the canyon mouth, while he studied the ground ahead with intensity of a man reading a book written in dust and stone. The sign was there for those who knew how to interpret it: scuff marks from shod horses on rock, the glint of sunlight on metal where someone had carelessly allowed a rifle barrel to catch light. "On the 3 men," he said quietly, his voice pitched to carry only to his companions. "Waiting on the rim where they can shoot down into the canyon like fish in a barrel." Wachiwi strung her bow with quick, practiced motions, testing the tension of sinew string against polished wood, with care of someone whose life might depend on the weapon's reliability. "Most likely Pete and that red-bearded friend of his, plus 1 more," she observed. "They know we must come this way to reach the judge quickly." Eliza forced herself to study the terrain with the same analytical attention her father had taught her to use when approaching a difficult piece of metalwork. The canyon walls were steep but not impossible to climb for someone desperate enough to try. The floor was littered with broken stone that would provide cover but would also make silent movement nearly impossible. "Can we go around?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. 20 miles north through Alkali Flats, where a woman on horseback would be visible for hours. Toko replied. 25 miles south through the Llano Estacado, where there's no water and heat can kill horses faster than bullets. Neither option was acceptable given their circumstances and time constraints. They had to go through Owl Canyon, which meant dealing with whatever reception Dietrich's men had prepared. The first rifle shot came as they entered the narrow passage, the bullet striking sparks from the stone wall inches from Toko's head. The sharp crack echoed back and forth between canyon walls until it sounded like an entire company of soldiers firing in volley. Eliza's mare shied violently sideways, nearly unseating her before she could regain control with firm hands on reins, and her father's remembered lessons about staying calm when animals panicked. Around them, more shots rang out from concealed positions on the rim, bullets whining off rock and kicking up clouds of red dust, stinging their eyes and filling their throats with grit. Down and find cover," Toko commanded, throwing himself from his saddle and pulling Eliza with him behind a boulder the size of a dining table. Wachiwi had already vanished into a maze of fallen rocks 20 yards away, her black gelding following with trained intelligence of a war horse. The gunfire intensified as their attackers realized they had their targets pinned in the canyon floor with nowhere to run. From the sound of it, there were at least 3 rifles working from different positions, probably Pete Rusty Joe, and 1 or 2 additional gunmen Dietrich had hired specifically for this ambush. "Stay here and keep your head down," Toko ordered, checking the load in his Spencer carbine with automatic movements of long practice. "Don't move unless I tell you to, and don't try to be a hero." But even as he spoke, another shot rang out, and Eliza heard a sound, making her blood freeze, the agonized scream of a horse in mortal agony. Wachiwi's gelding had taken a bullet in the chest and was thrashing between 2 boulders, its legs flailing helplessly as blood foamed from its nostrils. Without thinking, Eliza rose from behind her cover and sprinted toward the injured animal. She had seen too many horses die badly to let this one suffer needlessly, and her father's training overrode every consideration of personal safety. The gelding's eyes were rolling white with pain and terror, its breathing coming in short, agonized gasps, telling her the bullet had punctured both lungs. There was nothing she could do to save it, but she could at least end its suffering quickly and cleanly. She reached for the folding knife she carried in her boot, a tool her father had given her for exactly this kind of emergency. But another rifle shot from above sent her diving for cover again as the bullet struck stone inches from her head. "Foolish white woman," Wachiwi called from her position among the rocks, but there was approval mixed with exasperation in her voice. "The horse is beyond help now. Save yourself." From the canyon rim, Greasy Pete's voice echoed down with cruel satisfaction. "Come on out, girlie. We got all day to wait and plenty more ammunition where that came from. Old Dietrich wants you back real bad." Toko had worked his way along the canyon wall to a position where he could see one of the ambushers outlined against the sky. He brought his Spencer to his shoulder and squeezed the trigger, sending a .50 caliber bullet close enough to Pete's head to make the outlaw duck behind a rock outcrop with a yelp of surprise. But the return fire was immediate and accurate, forcing Toko to press himself flat against the canyon wall as stone chips flew like hornets around his position. One fragment opened a cut on his cheek, adding fresh blood to the bandage around his ribs from yesterday's wound. The tactical situation was rapidly becoming impossible. They were pinned down in the bottom of a stone funnel with limited ammunition and no clear way to reach their tormentors on the rim. Worse, every minute they spent trapped here gave Dietrich's other men more time to close the net around them. That's when Wachiwi made her move. The young Comanche woman had found a route up the canyon wall, taking advantage of every crack and ledge in the stone face, climbing with natural grace of someone who had been scaling cliffs since childhood. Her moccasined feet found purchase, where a white woman would have seen only smooth rock, and she moved with fluid confidence of water flowing uphill. Eliza watched in fascination and growing dread as Wachiwi reached a narrow ledge 30 feet above the canyon floor and began working her way toward a position where she could get a clear shot at the ambushers. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity. while Pete and his men focused attention on targets below, although they would never expect an attack from their own level. But Rusty Joe chose that moment to shift his position along the rim, and he caught sight of Wachiwi's movement from the corner of his eye. His rifle shot took her in the shoulder, spinning her around and sending her bow clattering down the cliff face to shatter on rocks below. For a heart-stopping moment, Eliza thought the young woman would fall to her death, but Wachiwi managed to catch hold of a twisted juniper growing from a crack in the stone. Blood was already soaking through her buckskin dress as she pulled herself back onto the ledge, but she was alive and conscious. More importantly, her desperate movement had revealed Rusty Joe's position to Toko, who put a Spencer bullet through the outlaw's thigh and sent him rolling away from the canyon edge with curses that would have made a mule skinner blush. That's one down. Wachiwi called her voice strained but determined. But I've lost my bow, and this shoulder won't hold me much longer. The sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed off canyon walls, more riders approaching from the direction they had come, which meant Dietrich had sent additional men to cut off their retreat. They were about to be caught between two forces with superior numbers and firepower. That's when Eliza noticed the loose boulder. Years of watching her father work with leverage and mechanical advantage had trained her to see structural weaknesses others might miss. High on the canyon wall directly above Pete's position, a massive stone sat balanced on a narrow ledge like a weapon waiting to be triggered. The boulder had probably been there for centuries, held in place by nothing more than gravity and gradual accumulation of smaller rocks around its base. But those supporting stones had been loosened by rifle shots, and the massive weight above was beginning to shift with each impact. "Toko," she called, pointing up at the precarious stone. "That boulder above Pete's position, if we could bring it down." He followed her gaze and immediately grasped what she was suggesting. It was a desperate gamble, requiring precise shooting and more than a little luck. But it might be their only chance to break the deadlock before reinforcements arrived. The Spencer carbine wasn't designed for precision work at long range, but Toko had been shooting since he was old enough to hold a rifle steady. He braced the weapon against a solid rock, took careful aim at the keystone supporting the boulder, and fired. His first shot struck the cliff face 6 inches to the left of his target, sending stone chips flying, but failing to dislodge the critical support. Pete, hearing the shot strike so close to his hiding place, began moving along the rim toward what he thought would be safer ground. Moving directly beneath the balanced boulder, Toko's second shot struck the support stone dead center, shattering it into fragments and sending the massive boulder sliding down the canyon wall in a grinding avalanche of stone and dust. Pete had time for one terrified scream before several tons of rock crashed down on his position, silencing him permanently beneath a cairn, marking his grave for generations to come. The sudden quiet that followed was almost as deafening as the gunfire had been. Rusty Joe's voice drifted down from somewhere along the rim, high and shaky with pain and dawning fear. "Pete, Pete, answer me, you worthless piece of—" "Pete's beyond answering anybody now," Toko called back. "But you're still breathing, which puts you one step ahead of him. Throw down your rifle, and we might let you ride away with that leg wound." There was a long pause, filled only with wind through stone, and the distant cry of a circling hawk. Then they heard a rifle clatter on rocks above, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone scrambling along the canyon rim as fast as an injured man could manage. Getting Wachiwi down from her precarious perch took the better part of an hour, with Toko finding handholds on the cliff face that seemed impossible to Eliza's inexperienced eyes. When he finally lowered the wounded woman to the canyon floor, she was pale from blood loss, but still conscious and alert. "The shoulder will heal," she said through gritted teeth as Eliza examined the wound with professional attention. The bullet went clean through, missing the major blood vessels. Eliza tore strips from her petticoat to fashion bandages, working with quick efficiency her father had drilled into her during their years treating injured animals on frontier trails. The wound was clean, but deep, and Wachiwi would need proper medical attention soon if infection was to be avoided. But they had lost precious time, and now they were down to 2 horses for 3 riders. Worse, Wachiwi's injury would slow their pace significantly just when speed was most crucial to reaching Judge Thorne before Dietrich could corrupt the legal process with bribes or forged evidence. As they prepared to leave Owl Canyon behind them, Eliza found herself looking back at the pile of rubble marking Greasy Pete's final resting place. She felt no satisfaction in his death, only a grim recognition that their troubles were far from over. Victor Dietrich still had men in the field hunting them, still had money to buy more guns and hire additional killers, and still had every reason to prefer them dead rather than alive if he couldn't control the legal proceedings in Blackthorn. The most dangerous part of their journey still lay ahead. By the time they reached the outskirts of Willow Spring, Wachiwi's condition had deteriorated enough to force them to seek medical attention despite the risks. Her shoulder wound was showing signs of infection, and the young woman's face had taken on the gray pallor that spoke of fever and blood poisoning beginning to take hold. Dr. Walter Marcel's small clinic sat like a beacon of hope on the town's edge, isolated enough to provide some privacy, but close enough to civilization to offer the medical supplies Wachiwi desperately needed. They approached it in the pre-dawn darkness, when the streets were empty, except for a few early risers heading out to tend livestock. Dr. Marcel himself was a thin, precise man in his late 30s, with steady hands and clear eyes, speaking of someone who had devoted his life to healing rather than harming. He had come west after the war between the states, carrying surgical skills and a profound hatred for those who profited from human suffering. His wife's death from cholera caused by contaminated water had only deepened his distrust of men like Victor Dietrich, who saw other people's lives as acceptable costs in their pursuit of wealth and power. "Bring her inside quickly," he said without preamble after Toko had explained their situation in a few terse sentences. "That shoulder wound is clean, but she's lost more blood than is safe for travel." His clinic was a marvel of frontier efficiency, shelves lined with glass jars containing carbolic acid and laudanum surgical instruments, gleaming with careful maintenance, and a cast-iron stove providing both heat and a means of sterilizing tools. The examination table was covered with clean linen smelling of lye soap and meticulous attention to detail. As Dr. Marcel worked to clean and stitch Wachiwi's wound, using silk thread and a curved needle catching lamplight like a tiny sword, Eliza found herself studying his technique with professional interest. Her father had taught her basic wound care, but this was surgery performed with skill bordering on artistry. "You have medical training," the doctor observed without looking up from his work. "Some," Eliza replied. "My father was a farrier, but he taught me to tend injuries on both people and animals. We saw plenty of both on the wagon trains." "Then you understand why this young woman needs at least 12 hours of complete rest before she can travel safely." His voice carried authority of a man stating medical fact rather than opinion. Toko, who had been maintaining silent watch at the window, turned at this pronouncement. "We don't have 12 hours. Dietrich's men will find our trail eventually, and when they do, they'll come with enough firepower to reduce this building to splinters." Dr. Marcel tied off the final suture with practiced precision and reached for a roll of clean bandages. "Then we'd better make certain you have everything necessary to reach Judge Thorne with your case intact." From a locked drawer in his desk, the doctor withdrew his own notary seal and a small bottle of red sealing wax. With careful deliberation, he examined Eliza's deed and her father's will, comparing the original notary's markings with samples from his own files. "But these documents are genuine and unaltered." He pronounced pressing his own seal into a drop of hot wax at the bottom of a brief statement written in his precise handwriting. This certification will carry considerable weight with Judge Thorne when you present your case. While the doctor worked, a soft knock at the back door announced the arrival of Beatrice Colette, the town's schoolteacher. She entered quietly, carrying a wrapped bundle and moving with careful discretion of someone who understood the value of not being noticed at inappropriate times. Beatrice was 32, unmarried by choice rather than circumstance, and possessed of sharp intelligence, making her a natural enemy of injustice wherever she encountered it. Her own family had lost their farm to a land swindler back in Ohio, leaving her with bitter personal knowledge of how the law could be twisted to serve those with money and influence. "Fresh clothing," she said simply, handing the bundle to Eliza. "And something else that might interest you." Inside the paper wrapping, Eliza found a traveling dress of dark blue wool, cut in the practical style favored by frontier women, but made from cloth fine enough to command respect in any courtroom. But Beatrice had also included something unexpected, a small leather journal filled with careful handwriting. "I've been keeping records," Beatrice explained quietly. "Every complaint filed against Victor Dietrich by local farmers, every suspicious transaction I could document, every witness who came forward and then mysteriously changed their story." She opened the journal to reveal page after page of meticulous documentation, dates, names, amounts of money, descriptions of intimidation tactics used against anyone who opposed Dietrich's schemes. It was the kind of evidence that could make or break a case in state court if they could reach an honest judge with it. "How did you gather all this?" Eliza asked, impressed by the thoroughness of the records. "By listening," Beatrice replied simply. "Teachers hear everything eventually. Children talk about what their parents discuss at home, farmers mention their troubles when they bring their sons to school, and women share their fears when they think no one is paying attention." As they prepared to leave the clinic, Dr. Marcel approached them with a grim expression. "There's something else you need to know about Victor Dietrich's operations. Something I discovered when I treated some of his injured miners last month." He led them to a cabinet containing medical records, pulling out several files marked with dates from the past 6 months. These men were all injured in what Dietrich claimed were mining accidents. But the injuries tell a different story. Eliza examined the records with growing horror. The wounds described weren't consistent with typical mining mishaps. They were the kinds of injuries inflicted by systematic beatings, torture designed to extract information or force compliance with Dietrich's demands. "He's been using violence against anyone who opposes him," she said, her voice tight with anger. "Not just legal intimidation, but actual torture." "And there's more," Dr. Marcel continued. "One of the miners told me about a meeting he overheard in Dietrich's office. They weren't just planning to capture you, they were discussing something called the final solution to the Indian problem." The implications of those words sent a chill down Eliza's spine. Dietrich wasn't just after her water rights. He was planning something much larger and more terrible, something that would justify military intervention against all the Comanche bands in the region. "We need to reach the state authorities immediately," she said. "Not just Judge Thorne, but the military commanders who might be able to prevent whatever Dietrich is planning." But their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, multiple riders moving at speed through the pre-dawn darkness. Dr. Marcel extinguished his lamp with a quick breath, plunging the clinic into darkness just as the first torches appeared on Willow Springs' main street. Through the window, they could see at least a dozen mounted figures moving with purposeful coordination. At their head rode a man Eliza recognized, even in silhouette, Victor Dietrich himself, sitting his horse with arrogant confidence of someone who had never seriously doubted his own inevitable success. "Then he's here," Wachiwi whispered despite her pain and weakness, still alert to tactical realities. "And he's brought enough men to take this building by storm." They were trapped in the clinic with limited options for escape. The building had only two exits, the front door facing the street where Dietrich's men were gathering, and the back door opening onto an alley with no cover for 30 yards in either direction. But rather than wait passively for capture, Eliza's mind raced with the mechanical problem-solving skills her father had taught her. The clinic's cast-iron stove was still hot from sterilizing instruments, and Dr. Marcel's supply of pure alcohol for cleaning wounds sat nearby in glass bottles. "Doctor," she said quietly, "do you have any phosphorus matches in empty bottles?" Marcel quickly grasped what she was suggesting. Together, they prepared several makeshift incendiary devices using medical alcohol-torn cloth and phosphorus-tipped matches. It wasn't elegant, but it would create enough distraction to give them a chance at escape. "The root cellar," Dr. Marcel said suddenly. "There's an old root cellar behind the building dug into the hillside during the town's early days. The entrance is hidden by brush, and it connects to a drainage tunnel leading to the creek." As Dietrich's men prepared to storm the building, Toko positioned himself at the front window while Eliza and the doctor prepared their diversions. At his signal, they hurled the improvised firebombs through the windows of nearby buildings, creating multiple blazes that spread confusion through the raider ranks. In the chaos that followed, they slipped out the back door and made their way to the hidden cellar entrance. But their escape was complicated by the arrival of unexpected allies townspeople emerging from their homes with rifles and shotguns, finally ready to stand against Dietrich's reign of terror. "Fire!" someone shouted as flames began to spread through the wooden buildings. "Everyone to the bucket brigade." The confusion gave them the cover they needed to reach the drainage tunnel and escape toward Willow Creek. As they crawled through the musty passage, they could hear the sounds of battle behind them, not the systematic massacre Dietrich had planned, but a genuine fight between his hired guns and angry townspeople who had finally found their courage. They emerged from the tunnel near the creek bank, where Beatrice waited with fresh horses and supplies. The schoolteacher had used the night's chaos to gather everything they would need for the final push to Blackthorn. "The whole town's fighting back now," she reported as they mounted up. "Dietrich may have won this battle, but he's lost any support he might have had among decent people." As they rode away from the burning town, Eliza realized that something fundamental had changed. They were no longer simply fleeing from Dietrich's hired killers. They were racing to prevent a larger catastrophe that could engulf the entire region in violence. The stakes had never been higher, and failure was no longer an option. They spent the rest of the night hidden in a grove of cottonwoods along Willow Creek, taking turns on watch while the others tried to rest. Wachiwi's fever had broken with Dr. Marcel's treatment, but she remained weak and would need careful handling if her shoulder wound was to heal properly. As dawn approached, they were joined by an unexpected ally. Rusty Joe emerged from the brush along the creek, his leg hastily bandaged and his rifle conspicuously absent. The outlaw looked haggard and desperate, but there was something different about his demeanor, a kind of resignation that spoke of a man who had finally reached the end of his rope. "Lee, don't shoot," he called out, raising his hands to show he was unarmed. "I got something you need to hear about Dietrich and his plans." Toko's hand moved instinctively toward his knife, but Eliza gestured for him to wait. There was something in Rusty Joe's voice that suggested genuine fear rather than deception. "Talk fast," she said, "and it better be worth hearing." "Dietrich's got more than just gunmen working for him," Rusty Joe said, speaking rapidly as if afraid he might lose his nerve. "He's been paying bribes to state officials, county judges, even some of the army officers at Fort Griffin. The whole system's been bought and paid for." He reached slowly into his jacket and withdrew a crumpled piece of paper. "This here's a list of everyone on his payroll, along with how much they've been paid and what they've done to earn it. I was supposed to deliver it to his contact in Austin, but after what happened to Pete, well, I decided I'd rather take my chances with you folks than trust Dietrich to keep his promises." Eliza examined the document with growing amazement. It was a comprehensive record of corruption reaching from local deputy sheriffs all the way up to state administrators in Austin. The amounts involved were staggering enough money to buy an entire government, which was apparently exactly what Dietrich had been doing. "Why are you giving this to us?" Toko asked, his voice carrying deep suspicion. "Because I've seen what Dietrich does to folks who outlive their usefulness," Rusty Joe replied. "Pete thought he was valuable to the organization right up until that boulder crushed him. I don't intend to end up the same way." The outlaws' revelation changed everything about their situation. They now had documentary proof of Dietrich's corruption network evidence that could bring down not just the mining magnate, but dozens of officials who had been facilitating his crimes. But it also made their journey to Blackthorn even more dangerous. With this much at stake, Dietrich would spare no expense or violence to prevent the evidence from reaching honest authorities. "There's something else," Rusty Joe continued. "Dietrich's planning to hit the Comanche camps tonight using his hired guns dressed as state militia. He's going to make it look like official state action, but it'll really be murder pure and simple. Then he'll claim the Indians attacked first, justifying whatever he wants to do next." The news hit Toko like a physical blow. His people were in immediate danger, and here he was, 40 miles away, with no means of warning them in time. The internal conflict was visible on his face as he weighed his duty to his band against his commitment to seeing justice done. "Go," Eliza said quietly, understanding his dilemma. "Take one of the horses and ride to warn your people. Wachiwi and I can reach Blackthorn with Beatrice's help." But Wachiwi spoke up from her position propped against a tree trunk, her voice weak but determined. "No. If we separate now, Dietrich wins either way. He destroys our band and captures you, or he gets you and then comes for us with state backing." She struggled to her feet, wincing with pain, but standing steady. "We stay together and finish this. Uncle Shyla is no fool. He'll smell trouble coming and move the band to safety. But if we don't reach the judge with this evidence, all our people will be at risk eventually." It was a hard choice, but Wachiwi's logic was sound. They had to trust in Shyla's wisdom and experience, while focusing on the larger battle that would determine the fate of everyone in the valley. "Then we ride for Blackthorn," Toko decided. "All of us together, and may the spirits guide our horses' hooves." They mounted up in the growing daylight, knowing they were racing against time and overwhelming odds. Behind them, Willow Springs was already stirring with news of the night's events. Ahead lay 40 miles of dangerous country and the most important legal proceeding any of them would ever witness. But for the first time since the ordeal began, Eliza felt they might actually have a chance at victory. They had evidence, they had allies, and they had each other. It would have to be enough. The race to Blackthorn began in earnest as the sun climbed toward its zenith. 4 riders pushing their horses hard across country that seemed to stretch endlessly under a sky promising another scorching day. They rode in formation, now Toko leading with Eliza and Wachiwi in the middle, and Beatrice bringing up the rear with a rifle across her saddle. The school teacher had surprised them all by insisting on joining the final push to Blackthorn, claiming that her presence would lend credibility to their story when they faced Judge Thorne. But Eliza suspected there was more to it than that Beatrice had lived with the consequences of injustice too long to miss the chance at striking back. They made good time across the open prairie. But as they approached the final stretch of their journey, signs of pursuit became increasingly evident. Dust clouds on the horizon spoke of multiple groups of riders converging on their position, and the occasional glint of sunlight on metal suggested they were being tracked by men with field glasses and telescopes. Dietrich's closing the net. Toko observed as they paused to rest their horses at a hidden spring known to generations of Comanche travelers. He's got riders coming from at least 3 directions, trying to box us in before we can reach the town. And how much further to Blackthorn? Eliza asked, studying the terrain ahead with growing concern. 8 miles across open ground, Beatrice replied. But there's another way, a longer route through Devil's Canyon that would add 5 miles, but keep us out of sight until we're almost at the courthouse. It was a difficult choice. The direct route was faster, but would leave them exposed to attack from multiple directions. The canyon route offered concealment, but would cost them precious time they might not have to spare. The decision was made for them by the appearance of riders on the ridge ahead, at least 6 men with rifles positioned to intercept them if they continued on the main trail. Dietrich had anticipated their most likely route and prepared accordingly. Devil's Canyon it is, Toko said, wheeling his horse toward the south. Stay close, stay quiet, and pray we don't run into any more surprises. The canyon was a twisted gash in the earth, its red sandstone walls carved by centuries of flash floods into fantastic shapes that provided both beauty and concealment. They rode single file along a narrow trail, winding between towering spires and natural arches, their horses' hoofbeats muffled by sand that had accumulated in the canyon bottom. But as they emerged from the far end of the canyon, they found their worst fears realized. Victor Dietrich himself waited for them with a dozen armed men positioned to cover the only exit from the narrow passage. The mining magnate sat his horse with the confident bearing of a man who had finally cornered his prey after a long and frustrating chase. His expensive clothes were dusty from hard riding, but his pale eyes burned with the intensity of someone who saw victory within his grasp. "Miss Charlotte," he called out in a voice carrying across the canyon mouth like the sound of money changing hands. "You've led us quite a chase, but I'm afraid your little adventure ends here. You're coming back to Copper Gulch with me where we can discuss your future in more comfortable surroundings." "I'm not going anywhere with you," Eliza replied, her voice steady despite the odds arrayed against them. "Especially not after learning about your plans for tonight." Dietrich's confident expression flickered slightly at her words, but he recovered quickly. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're referring to. As your legal guardian, I'm simply concerned about your welfare and eager to see you return safely to proper supervision." "We have evidence," Beatrice called out, holding up the leather portfolio containing all their documentation. "Records of your bribes, your violence, your plans to massacre innocent people. It's all here in writing, witnessed and notarized." For the first time since the confrontation began, genuine fear flashed across Dietrich's face. He had built his empire on the assumption that he could buy or intimidate anyone who opposed him, but written evidence was harder to suppress than inconvenient witnesses. But instead of ordering his men to attack immediately, Dietrich made a calculated decision. Drawing his revolver, he spurred his horse toward Beatrice, clearly intending to take the schoolteacher hostage and use her as leverage to secure the evidence. "Drop those papers or the woman dies," he shouted, pressing the gun barrel against Beatrice's temple as his men moved to surround the others. It was exactly the kind of desperate move Eliza had expected from a cornered predator, but Toko was ready for it. The Comanche warrior had anticipated Dietrich's tactics and positioned himself accordingly. As the mining magnate reached for Beatrice, Toko launched himself from his saddle in a flying tackle that took both men to the ground. They rolled in the dust, fighting desperately for control of the revolver, while their horses shied away from the violence. Dietrich was larger and heavier, but Toko had the advantage of training and desperation. The gun went off once harmlessly into the air before Toko managed to wrench it from Dietrich's grip. But the mining magnate wasn't finished. Pulling a hidden knife from his boot, he slashed at Toko's bandaged ribs, reopening the old wound and sending fresh blood streaming down the warrior's side. Toko grunted with pain, but didn't release his hold, instead driving his knee into Dietrich's solar plexus with enough force to double the man over. Around them, a larger battle was erupting as Dietrich's remaining men found themselves facing not just Eliza and her companions, but a new force that had just arrived on the scene. Judge Elias Thorne had ridden hard from Austin with 4 U.S. deputy marshals, following the trail of corruption that Beatrice's carefully worded telegram had revealed. "Lower your weapons immediately," the judge commanded, his voice carrying the full authority of federal law. "You are interfering with official state business and face charges of assault on federal officers." The arrival of legitimate authority shifted the tactical balance decisively. Several of Dietrich's hired guns began looking for ways to slip away from the confrontation without attracting attention to their movements. Fighting for money was one thing. Facing federal charges was something else entirely. But Dietrich himself was beyond such rational calculations. Breaking free from Toko's weakened grip, he stumbled toward the canyon wall where a narrow trail led up to an abandoned mine shaft. In his desperation, he still clutched Rusty Joe's list of bribes, apparently hoping to destroy the evidence before it could be used against him. "You think you've won something?" he screamed, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "You have no idea how deep this goes. I own judges, I own sheriffs, I own half the state legislature." He was backing toward the mine entrance as he spoke, the knife still in his hand and his eyes wild with the hysteria of complete desperation. But Eliza had studied the mining operation during their approach, and she knew something Dietrich had apparently forgotten in his panic. "The mine shaft," she called out to Judge Thorne. "It's been flooded for months. The supports are rotted through." Her warning came too late. As Dietrich reached the mine entrance, the waterlogged timbers gave way beneath his weight. He had time for one last scream of rage and terror before the entire structure collapsed, burying him beneath tons of rock and timber in a tomb of his own making. In the sudden silence that followed, Judge Thorne dismounted and surveyed the scene with the calm professionalism of a man who had witnessed the final act of many such dramas. The mining magnate's death had ended his reign of terror, but it had also eliminated their primary witness against the corruption network he had built. "Unfortunately," the judge said, examining the papers Beatrice handed him, "it appears Mr. Dietrich kept excellent records of his criminal enterprises. This evidence should be more than sufficient to root out the remaining corruption in our state government." The legal proceedings that followed took 3 days to complete, but the essential work was concluded within hours of Dietrich's death. Judge Thorne had brought proper clerks and notaries with him from Austin, along with the official forms required to record new land transfers and void fraudulent claims. Eliza's deed was officially recognized and recorded in the county clerk's office, establishing her clear and uncontested title to the water rights that had cost so many lives to protect. But more importantly, she used her new legal standing to negotiate comprehensive agreements with every farmer and rancher in the valley, ensuring that access to water would be shared equitably rather than monopolized by any single interest. The Comanche bands, including Toko's people, who had successfully evaded Dietrich's planned massacre, received formal recognition of their traditional grazing rights on the government land surrounding Ash River Valley. It wasn't a treaty in the old sense. The federal government no longer negotiated such formal agreements with Indian tribes. But it was a written compact signed by a U.S. district judge that would carry significant weight with future administrators. Victor Dietrich's mining empire was dissolved with the assets distributed among his victims according to a formula established by Judge Thorne. Several state officials implicated in the corruption network were also arrested, their trials scheduled for the following month in Austin. But perhaps the most important outcome was the message sent throughout Texas that corruption and violence would no longer be tolerated by federal authorities. Judge Thorne made it clear that anyone attempting to follow Dietrich's example would face the full weight of state and federal justice. 6 months later, as spring returned to the Texas Panhandle and winter grass began to show the first green shoots of renewed life, Eliza Charlotte stood at the edge of her property, where Ash River made its great bend through the valley that had become her home. The water ran clear and strong, fed by mountain snows and carrying life to everything it touched in an endless cycle of renewal and growth. She was no longer alone at the river's edge. Toko emerged from the cottonwood grove, where he had been checking the condition of trees weakened by the harsh winter, his movements still carrying the unconscious grace that had first caught her attention during their desperate flight from Dietrich's killers. In the months since Wachiwi's full recovery, he had taken on new responsibilities within his band, serving as both war leader and diplomat, as circumstances required. The relationship between them had developed, slowly built on shared hardship and mutual respect, rather than the sudden passion of romantic fiction. They had learned to read each other's thoughts and moods, to work together without constant discussion of objectives, to find comfort in each other's presence during the long nights when memories made sleep difficult. The irrigation channels are flowing well. Toko reported, referring to the system they had constructed together, using engineering principles that combined Comanche water management with techniques Eliza had learned from her father's mechanical knowledge. The spring flood should distribute evenly across all the grazing areas. Eliza nodded, checking the notations in the leather-bound ledger she had learned to maintain with obsessive precision. Water distribution required constant attention to detail, and the agreements she had negotiated with valley farmers depended on accurate record-keeping to maintain trust and prevent future conflicts. Henry Paul's wheat is already showing strong growth, she observed. Dr. Marcel thinks the improved irrigation system will double his yield this season. They worked together in comfortable silence, adjusting wooden gates and checking flow rates with the practiced efficiency of people who understood that their community's prosperity depended on such careful attention to seemingly mundane details. As the sun reached its zenith and the work became too warm for comfort, they settled on the riverbank to share a meal of cornbread and preserved meat. Around them, the valley spread in all directions, showing clear signs of the prosperity that careful resource management could bring even to the harshest frontier environments. Beatrice sent word from town. Eliza said, producing a folded letter from her pocket. The state governor plans to visit Willow Springs next month. He wants to examine our water-sharing agreements as a potential model for other frontier settlements. Toko received this news with the healthy skepticism that government attention usually deserved in his experience. Will you meet with him? We will meet with him, Eliza corrected gently. These agreements work because they respect both our communities equally. He needs to understand that fundamental principle. The subtle correction reflected the nature of their partnership, which had evolved from desperate alliance into something deeper and more enduring than either had initially expected. They had married under both Texas law and Comanche custom, creating legal protections for Eliza's property rights, while acknowledging Toko's status as her equal partner in all significant decisions. It was an arrangement that satisfied the practical requirements of white law while honoring the cultural expectations of both their peoples. More importantly, it was founded on genuine affection and respect that had been tested by shared danger and proven reliable under the most extreme pressures. As they prepared to return to their afternoon responsibilities, Eliza noticed something glinting in the river mud near the bank where spring floods had shifted the channel's course. Curious, she waded into the shallow water to investigate what appeared to be a small metal object partially buried in the sediment. It was a silver locket tarnished black, but still intact after its long submersion in the river's flow. Inside, protected by the sealed case, was a photograph of a young woman and a small piece of folded paper with writing that remained legible despite water damage. The photograph showed a face Eliza recognized from her earliest childhood memories, her mother who had died of fever when Eliza was barely 10 years old. The paper contained a brief message written in her father's careful handwriting, apparently intended for her to discover at some future time. "My dearest daughter," the message began. "If you are reading this, then you have found your way to the place we always planned to make our permanent home beside the river that runs through our land. This locket belonged to your mother, and she made me promise to hide it somewhere along the river where you would find it when you were ready to understand its meaning." The letter continued with explanations of her father's careful legal preparations, his negotiations with state officials, and his determination to leave her with clear title to resources that could support her throughout her life. Most importantly, it revealed that William Charlotte had always expected her to face challenges like Victor Dietrich men who would attempt to steal through violence or fraud what they couldn't obtain through honest effort. Your mother believed that water represents the source of all life, and that those who control it have a sacred responsibility to share it wisely. The letter concluded, "She made me promise that if anything happened to us, you would learn this lesson and carry it forward to future generations. The river will flow long after we are all gone. Ensure that it flows clean and free for those who come after us." Eliza read the message aloud to Toko, her voice steady despite the tears that traced silver lines down her cheeks. When she finished, they sat together beside the flowing water, each contemplating the people they had lost and the responsibilities they had inherited from those who had gone before. "Your parents possessed great wisdom," Toko observed quietly. "They understood that water represents life itself, and that life must be shared generously if it is to continue flowing through future generations." Wachiwi understood the same truth. Eliza replied, thinking of the young woman who had recovered fully from her wounds and was now teaching the children of both communities about the old ways of reading weather and caring for the land. "She nearly died protecting our people's future, just as my parents lived their entire lives building foundations for mine." As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the valley, they walked together toward the settlement that had grown around their combined properties. It remained relatively small, perhaps 50 buildings housing 200 people. But it was expanding steadily as word spread about the prosperity that fair resource management could bring to frontier communities willing to cooperate rather than compete destructively. The schoolhouse Beatrice had established stood at the settlement's center, its bell tower visible for miles across the prairie. Inside, children from both white and Comanche families learned reading, writing, and the mathematical principles of irrigation engineering that would serve them throughout their adult lives. Dr. Marcel's rebuilt clinic treated patients without regard to their cultural background or financial resources, accepting payment in goods and labor from those who possessed more energy than currency. His medical supplies were funded partly by state appropriations and partly by profits from the commercial enterprises that improved water access, had made economically viable. The general store, grain elevator, blacksmith shop, and numerous other businesses that had established themselves in the growing community all demonstrated the prosperity that emerged when people chose cooperation over conflict in managing shared resources. It was not a perfect society. Disputes over water allocation still arose periodically. Cultural tensions occasionally created friction between different groups, and the constant challenges of frontier survival remained as demanding as ever. But it was a community where people could plan for the future with reasonable confidence that their efforts would be rewarded by something more substantial than mere survival. As they reached their own house, a solid structure of stone and timber built to withstand both winter storms and summer heat, Eliza paused to look back at the river that had brought them together and continued to sustain their growing community. "Do you believe it will endure?" she asked. "This peace we've managed to build here?" Toko considered the question with the gravity it deserved, drawing on a lifetime of experience with both cooperation and conflict among different peoples. "Nothing human lasts forever," he replied thoughtfully. "But some foundations prove strong enough to support many different structures over time. The children learning in Beatrice's school will carry these lessons to other places when they're grown. Farmers who have learned to share water fairly will teach their sons the same principles. The peace we've established here will echo in other communities, other generations." That evening, as they sat on their porch watching stars emerge in the vast Texas sky, Eliza found herself thinking not about the battles they had won, but about the future they were continuing to build together. Somewhere in the darkness, Ash River pursued its ancient course toward distant seas, carrying life and hope, and the promise of tomorrow to everything it encountered along its path. It had been worth fighting for, and it would be worth preserving for as long as they drew breath to defend it. In her hands, her mother's locket caught the light from their oil lamp, its silver surface gleaming with the same steady radiance as the river that had brought it back to her. Like the river itself, like the land that supported them, like the community they had helped establish, it had survived because it was founded on something more enduring than mere force or temporary advantage. It was built on love, love for the land, love for future generations, and love for the simple truth that all life depends on water. And water belongs to everyone who treats it with proper respect.